And now for something completely different. This will not be a memorable sermon, but I'm sure you will remember this service. It's the most beautiful rendering of a beautiful song. Back in the olden days of my Unitarian boyhood, this Sunday, the Sunday after Labor Day, was when church got started again each year. In New England especially, except in the big cities, which are few, closing the church for summer was a common practice. And many of my colleagues up there each year still enjoy a seasonal semi-sabbatical, at least from the pulpit. Of course, they all devote their summer reading time to reading, studying, researching, and planning for the year ahead. Sure they do. We used to call it the best two reasons for being a Unitarian, July and August. And we had an explanation for our practice that was divided in two camps. One was we were the only ones God trusted enough to give us time off. The other that she just got tired of being lectured to every Sunday. These days, most of our churches at least slow down in the summer with less worship and more potlucks and pool parties. But whatever they do, for most, this second Sunday in September marks the beginning of a new year. Some call it Homecoming Sunday or Ingathering. Now, I know from previous experience that here in the Valley, ingathering takes place more slowly than elsewhere, as the last of the snowbirds gradually return to their winter roosts. The theme for this month, and this is only the second Sunday I've dealt with themes, is worth and dignity, a phrase which most of you will recognize as part of the first of the 7 so-called principles and purposes of the Unitarian Universalist Association. I'll have more to say about worth and dignity next Sunday, but I thought on this Sunday we take a historical look at just how these principles as a whole came into being and came to occupy such a prominent, even defining place in the common understanding of our faith. And they do have a history. At first, I was planning to take that history back more than a century, but you will probably be happy to hear that I cut it in half. Only partly because, having sold or given away most of my UU books when I retired, I tossed out some references I would have needed, but really, the last 50 years or so will suffice. The hard part for me is to think of years of my own lifetime as history. Now, my memory is famously unreliable, but I don't know if this is true of the rest of you. There are odd things that just come into my mind, things that I remember from the past, no particular pattern. And one of them is 2 sermons that my minister preached in our then brand new church building in Concord, New Hampshire. This was during my high school years. One sermon was on Playboy magazine, and the other was his 1959 sermon reporting on the dramatic events of the culminating joint meetings of the Universalists and Unitarians in Syracuse, New York, which led to the final confirmation a year later in Boston to consolidate, some say merge, and take the name Unitarian Universalist Association. The 2 denominations had been flirting with each other for many years, some say as long as a century. But in the late 1950s, after 3 or more years of focused and intensive work by a few determined church leaders, some manipulation, and endless votes, which had to be passed by both denominations separately with the exact same wording, it was finally done, almost. At the very end, one issue arose in Syracuse that threatened to sabotage the entire effort. and it had to do with the wording of one of the proposed principles of the new association. It all literally came down to a single three-letter word, and it's not God. That final decisive meeting began at 8 p.m. and ended around 3 a.m. The introduction to the proposed principles, 6 in all, read that, quote, "The members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, dedicated to the principles of a free faith, unite in seeking, 1, to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship." And then came this, which led to controversy: "To cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in our Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man." Voting separately, the Universalists were fine with that, 4-1. But the 600 Unitarians were split. You may be able to guess why. Among them, the traditional theists wanted not only a reference to God, but also our Christian heritage. The middle ground theists preferred simply acknowledging, quote, "the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition," and the humanists would have liked to do without any reference to deity at all. The vote to accept this wording failed by 7 votes out of the almost 600 still in their seats after midnight. It took some doing, including voting down a motion to adjourn, but finally, by changing just one word, it passed by a small margin. The final amendment changed the word "our Judeo-Christian heritage" to "the Judeo-Christian heritage." One 3-letter word. And as my boyhead minister reported in his sermon, a headline in one of the Syracuse papers the next day boldly announced, "The Unitarians, Christ out, God in doubt." Now, I thought of this. I don't know if anybody else has noticed this, but twice the principles preceded by a few years a hymnal. At the beginning, starting in 1960, maybe even before, the denomination began plans for a new hymnal and Hymns for the Celebration of Life, informally known as the Blue Hymnal, was published in 1964. Interestingly, the Unitarians and Universalists had, in 1937, 27 years before the merger, joined forces to publish Hymns of the Spirit. There was a joint commission of 2 that worked together. And that book was actually the first hymnal that became into general use in most of the denominational churches, and was probably important to that merger time as well. Nicknamed the Red Hymnal, it was one of the most highly regarded Protestant hymnals of the 20th century and is still in use today in some of our most traditional congregations, which are few and dying. I just threw that in, I don't know. Talking about traditional congregations in the UUA, you have to look pretty hard with a microscope. VUU was among the first churches to affiliate with the UUA rather than the AUA, American Unitarian Association, or the Universalist Church of America. As a new member congregation, VUU received a framed copy of the original UUA principles, which still hangs on a wall in the administration building. How many have ever even noticed it? Oh, that's a lot. 3 or 4. Here's a copy of it. That same framed document hangs somewhere in probably most of the churches of our churches countrywide, now just as an historical artifact. In the late 1970s and early 80s, unsurprising considering the cultural changes taking place just then, both in general and the feminist movement in particular, the original UUA principles came to be seen as ripe for revision, and not only just linguistically. The revised principles and purposes were adopted as a UUA bylaw by the General Assemblies of 1984 and 85. They are different from the original, but with one or two exceptions, not radically so. What is different is how they have taken such a center stage position in the life of our congregations. Preachers organize sermon series around them. Many books have been written about them. Even I contributed a chapter to one of them. I'd forgotten that, but I found it. A children's version of them has been created, and the children's version is on those 6. Where's the 7th banner? Somewhere back there. Back there, there's 7. And those are not anything like the language of the real principles, but they're useful for the kids, I guess. Now, this stands in sharp contrast to the original principles. As I said, they hang on the walls of most of our churches, but nobody pays, or in my experience, ever did pay much attention to them, at least not until the move to revise them. They were more like a decoration. And then the difference, and this is this hymn connection that I was trying to make, the difference is largely that back in 1964, no one even thought to organize a hymnal around them. But the process of revising the principles took a long time, years, and provoked the attention of many Unitarian Universalists across the country. And the hymnal just happened to turn out to be the next major denominational project, and it too took several years to prepare and also evoked considerable interest. The Hymn Book Resources Commission, they always give long names to committees at the UUA, early on decided to structure the new hymn book around the purposes and principles, which, as published, take up fully 2 pages right up front. You can't miss them. I don't know, you got any hymnals? Some of you can look if you want. And incidentally, right in that same upfront location is where, in a typical Christian hymnal, you're likely to find the Apostles' Creed. Just saying. But just as long as we keep in mind that the principles are not a creed, but only a bylaw, and that bylaws can always be amended, they serve a useful purpose, especially to those who are newcomers, most of whom come unaccustomed to the seeming paradox of a creedless faith. So that's about how far I got yesterday, and time is late. I did a little exercise for myself that is so boring that I won't inflict it on you. But what I did was work out by principle by principle. There were 6 original principles, and then a famous 7th was added at the revision time. And next Sunday, we're going to talk about the first of these. But what I was surprised to find was how much continuity there was from the one to the other. And the 7th principle, which is the famous one, was added. The committee worked for 2 or 3 years and submitted a draft and another draft, and that kind of process went on for a long time. But it wasn't until the final vote was about to be taken that 2 or 3 amendments were offered, changing the principles. And that 7th principle, which can anybody recite the 7th principle for me? So I'm being a little... Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And it's a very strong concluding principle, I think, and one of the best things about the principles altogether. On the other hand, the thing that I will leave you with to just contemplate is that the old principles, let's call them, read, just reading down from the top, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, dedicated to the principles of a free faith, unite in seeking no, that's not right. Go back to the original document. I got 3 more sermons to do this month, so you gotta, if you want to come back and find out what I'm looking for, just promise me you'll be here. I just had that thing. Where was it? There it is. Okay, no, I hit it right. In accordance, the members of the Unitarian Universalist Association dedicated to the principles of a free faith unite in seeking to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship. And, I just, speaking for myself, I think that's, both of those are clear and, in my view, true. We're going to talk about truth maybe next week. But in the revision, that got bumped down to 4th, and it was no longer identified as the foundation of our religious fellowship. And what we will be talking about next week was in the 3rd original principle in some form, to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. The first principle in the revised edition is the one we will take up next week. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. No, that's not right. That's wrong. Oh, I see what I was doing. Can't even figure out my own chart. Yeah, the first of the principles is in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And that's what we'll be talking about next week. And we're going to have a beautiful ending to this service, not because of me,